George Topalidis from the University of Florida will give a paper entitled "It's All Greek to Me, the Impact of Mass Media on Contested Immigrant Identity."
Okay, first of all, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, so I'm not going to need a microphone. I'd like to begin by thanking the selection committee for allowing me to speak to you today. And I'd like to begin by bringing your attention to this photograph, which I collected from the Greek American community in the Midwest of the United States. As you can see, it is a fez, and it is missing the emblem of the Ottoman Empire. And I'd like to argue with you, not with you, but for you today, that there is a reason this is missing, and that reason will become evident as I continue my talk this afternoon. So first and foremost, the theoretical foundation for this work, race and conflict theory. You may notice that all of these different theoretical foundations come under the auspices of different disciplines. My discipline happens to be sociology, though. So race and conflict theory is one of the theoretical foundations. So ideas of whiteness, which were discussed today, othering, ethno-national barriers, Orientalism, the idea of the social self and racial identity, as well as observed race. These are two themes developed by, or rather talked about by Wendy Roth, a sociologist. And memory studies, the next major theoretical foundation. So how are traumatic memories passed down from generation to generation, from those that lived them to those that just heard about them from parents and grandparents. Specifically, that would be post-memory. And then labeling theory, which I borrow from criminology. This theory specifically talks about how labels affect behavior, and if they do. It's actually contested if they do. And part of that labeling theory is the techniques of neutralization that are used by those that are perceived as other in order to kind of defend their position, or in some ways try to become part of the dominant group in these in-group, out-group dynamics. So the subject of my talk today are immigrants. Immigrants from the former Ottoman Empire that left under different circumstances. Some for economic reasons, others as refugees, and traveled first to Greece in the early 20th century. And it is there that they were greeted in different ways. In two ways, really. With open arms, or with ethno-national or racist feelings. And I would argue that this group of immigrants, as well as immigrants from Greece, took this reality that they were living in Greece with them to the United States. Now, in the United States, there is a narrative that develops in the early 20th century, in mass media specifically. So, as you'll see, different intellectuals and also newspapers in the early 20th century build this narrative of there being a new Greece, Nea Elada, and therefore those that are part of that new Greece, Neo-Eladites, or New Greeks, and then an old Greece, Palea Elada, and those that come from Palea Elada are Paleo-Eladites, or old Greeks. And both of these types of people ultimately immigrate to the United States, and they're viewed in the United States as a collective, Greek immigrants. But things are more complicated than that, I would argue, based on evidence that I will provide for you today. I believe that there were different ethno-racial barriers that developed in the United States under racial pressures coming from American society on this immigrant group. So we have first and foremost a barrier between Greeks from Greece, or those that are perceived to be Greeks from Greece, by non-Greeks. So natives, I guess you would call them, for lack of better words. And this barrier is a barrier that pertains to understandings of whiteness. So if you were perceived to be something other than Anglo-Saxon Protestant in the early 20th century, chances are you weren't perceived as being white, and therefore being American. But if you could somehow convince individuals that fell within this group that you were, then you would ultimately attain quote-unquote whiteness. Okay, this would be bestowed upon you by people who believed in it to some degree. And the result would be that you would have access to things like better jobs, upward mobility, upward social mobility. Not always the case, but at least that's the ideal version of the story. The other ethno-racial barrier is found between Greeks from Greece and Ottoman or Turkish Greeks. Ottoman or Turkish Greeks, these are the Rum, the individuals that were born in the Ottoman Empire, part of modern Turkey, as you'll see. That's why I'm particularly interested in, and ultimately come to the United States, and some of them live amongst church-built communities. So they enter these communities where Greek Orthodox churches already exist, and try to become part of the greater dominant group, the collective that is there associated with these churches. Others do not. Others are amongst Americans, amongst natives, on their own. So they have a completely different experience than the individuals that I'm about to talk about with you this afternoon. But there is this idea of the social self, and that's what really ultimately we're looking at here. Okay, we can't really know for sure, excuse me, we can't really know for sure how people imagine themselves. They can tell us, okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the truth or it's the way that they truly feel about their identity. So the social self is how we perceive them and what they show us for us to perceive. So in the case of Ottoman Turkish Greeks, there is this perception amongst the Greek communities that exist in the United States that these people are somehow not a part of them, as you will see. So I have some research questions. Is there an ethno-national barrier that exists between Greeks from Greece and Ottoman or Turkish Greeks? And is there any impact by Greek immigrant mass media on this ethno-racial barrier? So current scholarship looks at this group of immigrants either through a localist perspective or through political differences. That is, they will say, the current literature will say, well, this is just one homogeneous Greek immigrant group. Or it'll say, no, these people are from different cities and towns throughout Greece, so their identity is linked somehow to that town or to that city or to that region. And then in another vein, there are political differences. So in this time period, this immigrant group is going to be seen as either adhering to the Venizelists or the monarchists, one or the other. And I'm going to argue something different. I'm going to argue that this immigrant group consisted of two major subgroups. One of them being Greeks from Greece, and one of them being Greeks from the parts of the Ottoman Empire that are currently part of Turkey. And I'm going to also argue that over time, we see a suppression of that identity. Sometimes it's willful, so these people voluntarily not give up, but tend to not identify as much with that new Greek identity as they did in the past. And with that said, the methodology that I'm using, contemporaneous books written by Thomas Burgess, Serafim Kanoutis, and J.P. Ksenides, these are intellectuals of the time in the early 20th century, all of them lawyers, involved in the community, in the diaspora community of the United States, and also with inroads to the Greek American community that was developing at the time. Newspaper articles, I'm going to present for you one written by Michael A. Brouchos, an op-ed to the National Herald, and finally interview excerpts that I collected over the past 2 years throughout the United States. This is a sample of in-depth, semi-structured interviews, approximately 200 in number currently, The sample consists of individuals that are aged between 40 and 90 years old, so the second and third generation of immigrants, male and female. They were recruited using a combination of snowball sampling and also purposeful sampling methods. Okay, and the findings. Well, one of the things that we find in these interviews is what existing literature calls the non-threatening narrative. Okay, and what is this non-threatening narrative? Well, one sample I found was written by Thomas Brouchos, and in this non-threatening narrative, what we see is a willingness of the Greek community to kind of present itself as not a threat, literally, to the American collective, to the dominant American identity. So basically what you will see Thomas Brouchos argue is that the Greeks are, worthy of being accepted into the American collective identity.
Modern Greek, as it is written, is as much like ancient Greek as modern English is like Chaucer, or the language of Xenophon is like that of Homer. The modern Greek kingdom and the modern Greek people are literally steeped in the history of their race. It is told to the children at home, it is shown to them at school. The talk of man in newspapers is filled with historical allusions, ancient, medieval, and modern, and so are their customs and various superstitions.
All right, so this was written in 1913, okay? And the next example I have for you was written by Seraphim Kanounis, himself an immigrant from Greece. Thomas Brouchos was born in the United States. He was an American, a native, I guess, again, for lack of better terms, but native to the United States, born there. Seraphim Kanounis was an immigrant from Greece, or old Greece, okay? As, again, mass media of the time referred to that group. So let's see what Seraphim says.
As men of letters, the Greeks are distinguished for their brightness of mind and their inborn refinement. As artists, they're inspired by their creative genius, that splendid inheritance of their forefathers. As soldiers, they're an example of fearlessness and bravery. It is not a rare thing to discover a modern Phidias in a bootblack parlor, nor to see a Greek carry off the prize in an artist's contest from scores who were fighting from the laurel.
So in taking in these two excerpts, okay, what do we see here? We see that they're directed towards a specific audience, okay? They're both written in English, all right? And they're being distributed not just among the Greek immigrant communities, but also amongst the communities at large. So the argument that's being made to English-speaking and English-reading people through these two excerpts, at least, is you have nothing to fear about the Greeks. They are just as good as the American population that is here. In fact, there's a lot of things that are common. No need to discriminate against them. They are worthy of being included into the American collective identity. The next excerpt is written by John Sinidis in 1922. And there's a slight difference in this one from the previous two that I'm hoping you'll pick up on. If not, I'll emphasize it.
The Greek race has never ceased to exist in history, so that there must be at least some descendants of the ancient among the modern Greeks. And it is usually true that many races and people in Asia Minor and elsewhere have been thoroughly assimilated and Hellenized. All the people bearing the name of Greek at present are imbued with the same national consciousness and cherish the same traits and characters, intellectual and moral, as characterized the ancient.
So now all of a sudden we see the use of this non-threatening narrative for a different reason, okay? This excerpt is also in English. All right, so it is, again, directed towards an English-speaking audience. However, for the first time, we find mention of Asia Minor, and that all of the immigrants coming from Asia Minor now are Greek, and therefore not a threat to whom? Okay, and I think the answer there is going to become evident as we continue. The next excerpt is from an op-ed, like I said, written by Michael A. Brouchos. This is also an immigrant who immigrated to the central United States, so he's living in the Midwest. Okay. And let's see what he says.
It is with a great sadness that we Asia Minor Greeks see our old Greek brethren expressing themselves tacitly, calling us Turkphons. We reply to you therefore by saying that amongst us there is a minority population of 5% for whom it was not possible to learn their mother tongue. This was because of the Turkish tyranny that we have experienced 100 years prior. We enslaved Greeks are proud over the past 100 years that we have been free. We have successfully Hellenized our tongue under Turkish duress throughout upper and lower educational organizations. We maintain these organizations through our own donations. We freed Greek in 100 years, have not successfully spread knowledge of the Greek language outside of Athens. We have been incapable of removing the Albanian tongue from Menidi and Kuluri, which is blemish on the reputation of the Greek Department of the Education. Rest assured, free Greeks, we Asian Minor Greeks, will soon remove every remnant of the Turkish tongue from our midst. There are 70,000 brave Asian Minor men fighting for this very cause, so that one day, for our motherland Greece, all Greeks will be free, both new Greeks and old Greeks.
This is written in Greek, okay, in the National Herald, and it is for a Greek-speaking audience now. All right, so what's happening here is we see the adaptation and the adoption of this non-threatening narrative that was first used towards a different audience, towards the American audience, all right, to pacify them, to make them rest assured that the Greeks are no threat. Now what we see is an adaptation of that narrative, I argue here, by immigrants from the former Ottoman Empire, today Turkey, again for the same reason, to pacify the Greeks, the old Greeks, those coming from Greece proper. Okay, that is all that media, the mass media of the time, will offer us in terms of helping us understand whether or not there was an ethno-racial barrier of any kind during this time. The other evidence that I have for you comes from the interviews that I mentioned. Okay, so what you're going to see here now is there the answer, hopefully, to the question: is there any transfer of this ethno-racial barrier to communities and to individuals? Does anybody really ascribe to this in any way within their community or within their families? And the first piece of evidence I have for you is called The Wedding. This was from an interview conducted with a third-generation woman in the northeastern United States. Let's see what she says.
My grandparents essentially eloped. That Greek-Turkish thing really was not good. My great-grandmother didn't want to see her daughter married.
What Greek-Turkish thing?
The Spartan great-grandmother said, but I didn't bring you here to marry the Turk. So my grandmother said, I'm going to marry him, and her parents didn't come, and she got married in her sister-in-law's and brother-in-law's living room.
What year was this?
1920.
So this is on an individual level. We see that there's at least some evidence of this narrative really penetrating families. Like they know of this. They know of this dichotomy. Okay. Does it happen on a group or community level? And the next set of clips that I have for you comes from one community in the Midwestern United States, and I think provides some evidence in that vein. Right? So the first one is called Big John.
For example, there's one story that they were Turkofona. They could only speak Turkish, so they came here, they go to the church, but they're speaking Turkish. And people were saying, what are they doing here? Shouldn't they be in a mosque? Well, they understood what they were saying. That offended some people. And then I heard there was a guy called Big John. He was like the president of, he was a big man too. And whenever there was a problem, people always went to Big John. And they said Big John pointed to everybody and called them out and he said, we're going on the other side of town and we're going to start our own congregation.
So because of this, this perception of these immigrants as being non-Greek, okay, we have some evidence here of a parish splitting in two, and a new church being built for those that are perceived to be Turcophones. Okay. Why is this happening? The next excerpt comes from and I apologize, I didn't really give you demographic information. In the first excerpt, the gentleman is of the third generation male. Okay, so the second excerpt is second generation female from the same community. And like I said, she's going to provide for us some information or some insight as to why perhaps this occurred.
The Asia Minor Greeks were different than the mainland Greeks. The mainland Greeks always thought they were better than the Asia Minor Greeks. That's what the split was all about.
And finally, one of the things that is important to keep in mind here is in terms of penetration of this idea in communities and within groups, to what extent did it penetrate their get-togethers, their celebrations, their ethnic and national celebrations. The last clip, again, is by the same gentleman from the Midwestern United States, third generation. He's going to provide some insight for us on that. And this clip is called Greek Independence Day, which is when this happened, actually, according to him.
When there was a Greek Independence Day, when they would meet at the hall down on the southeast end of town, it was Greek Independence Day. They were doing a parade down there, and a Pontian held up the Greek flag, and somebody said, "Why is this Turk holding up the Greek flag?"
Okay, so in conclusion, is there any evidence of an ethno-racial barrier between Old Greeks and New Greeks in the United States in the early 20th century? I'd like to point out that there is some evidence towards that, for sure. This is preliminary evidence, but there certainly seems to be some type of a divide in the early 20th century between these two groups. And it has to do with Orientalism. It has to do with these ideas of people being perceived as inferior because they're coming from the Ottoman Empire, they're Turkish, and therefore that's why they don't belong within the bigger Greek collective identity. And then what's the role of mass media? What it plays as far as emergence and pervasiveness of this ethno-racial, but well, you saw it. I mean, you saw it in the op-ed newspaper clip that I provided for you. There are more clips like that one, okay, that talk about there being some type of a divide, or even the perception of there being Old Greeks and New Greeks, okay, and newspaper editors, reporters referring to these groups as such. And as far as application of findings, well, there's a lot of different immigrant groups in the United States that are perceived in similar ways as these homogenous collectives, right, the Italians. And yet there's literature that says, no, there's Northern Italians and Southern Italians. The Jews, and that's a collective. Well, no, it isn't. There's literature that says that there's Eastern European Jews and Western European Jews. And I think what this project, what I'm going to try to do ultimately, is kind of dig into that a little bit more. And I think we should, I'm going to definitely try to focus on seeing if, what the constructs of these more nuanced identities are, and why are they being perceived the way that they're being perceived. The application, as far as modern examples, would be for sure the Dreamers and the incoming immigrants, the new incoming immigrants from Syria, from Mexico into the United States. All of these are relevant cases, and I believe we should all spend some time looking more into why they're being perceived as collectives, the Dreamers or the Syrian refugees, because there's certainly some evidence to show that the Greeks were not a collective. Thank you, and if you have any questions.